Thank you so much, Simon. This is a keynote session. The nature of a keynote session is there's no Q&A. The Q&A will be in the evening when we have our come together, and you can meet this guy face to face and speak to him. The next professor in here is Bob Berg from Philadelphia. He spent his whole career on resuscitation and children, pediatric life support, and he looked into something which is kind of very interesting if you look into ACLS guidelines like we know it. He, I would say, has put physiology back into our concepts by research. I'm really absolutely looking forward to hear you talk.
While we're waiting for this to come along, I want to thank, first of all, it's really an honor and a privilege to be here in front of this group. I have the highest esteem that I could possibly have in terms of time-dependent decision-making that has to be done by all of you, and you're the heroes of medicine to be able to go in the environments that you go into and or come to you in your emergency departments and be able to deal with the varied life-threatening kinds of things and take that on. So I'm so happy to be able to be at this meeting, and I want to thank Simon and the committee for inviting me here. So thank you all so much. What Simon asked me to talk about was a little bit of an overstatement. He said unlocking individualized pediatric CPR, and I wish I could unlock anything. My kids will let you know I don't unlock anything at home, but I work on things and try and be better. I have a lot of conflicts, but most of my conflicts are intellectual conflicts. There's a little bit of funding from the NIH, a lot of funding from the NIH over time, and I've been involved in a lot of guidelines for better and for worse. It's been over 60 years since Cowenhoven and Jude Knickerbocker at the Johns Hopkins University described closed chest massage in the quote-unquote modern era. They looked at 20 patients who had postoperative asphyxia. They were in hallways. They didn't have PACUs back then. They had hallways. And Jim Jude, a cardiovascular fellow, saw what they were doing in animals. And based on the success of CPR in an animal model, he saw somebody have a cardiac arrest, and he did the same CPR that he saw them do on dogs. Several of them were children. They hadn't really thought about ventilation yet, so the initial patients only got chest compressions because they hadn't considered ventilation yet. And 20 of 20 survived the cardiac arrest. Still, the best survival rate, immediate survival rate in the history of CPR in the first study. Shame on the rest of us. 14 of the 20 were long-term survivors. How many of you have done CPR with an art line in? You're going to recognize that in their next publication the next year that they were not doing closed chest massage. They were doing something very vigorous to get blood pressures of 150 over 40 in a couple of adults, and one child after Blalock-Taussig surgery had blood pressures of 110 over 38. That is not massage. That's a forceful compression. That takes a lot of energy. If you try and do that for 20 minutes, God bless you. You need to switch every couple minutes, and you should be sweating, and if you're not doing it right. About 25 years later, it was discovered by a couple of my colleagues at the University of Arizona. One was a past president of the Society of Academic Emergency Medicine, Art Sanders, who got me into this business. And they showed that coronary perfusion pressure was critically important for successful CPR. That is the pressure when you take your hand off the chest in the aorta minus the right atrium where the coronary sinus goes. If the coronary perfusion pressure in these animal models was greater than 20, the animals came back. If it was less than 20, they didn't. That was approximately an aortic diastolic pressure of 30, which is interesting. It was in that slide over there, but there's very little data to support what Simon just showed, but he's right. And they did subsequently show that was related to not just pressures, but flow. and they looked at myocardial blood flow and myocardial oxygen delivery, and basically that was about the cutoff point for these animal studies. Here it is 25 years after the first description that they can bring everybody back right away miraculously at Johns Hopkins. But in children's hospitals in the United States, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, where I am, and the Children's National Medical Center in DC, there was only about a 10% survival rate. 25 years later, we all thought we could bring people back from the dead regularly, but we really couldn't. And based on that, when the first American Heart Association Pediatric Advanced Life Support course was developed in 1987, they decided it was futile to do CPR. And let's just teach recognition and treatment of respiratory failure and shock and avoid cardiac arrest, and let's not bother with that in our courses. Well, Vinay Nadkarni, one of my long-term collaborators, and myself became the chairs of the PALS committee in the 1990s, and we said, we think we could do better, and let's start training, consistent with the discussions earlier about training and working our way towards success. And with no changes in guidelines, with no new information that was going to change the world, but just using the information that was not dramatically different than what they said in 1960. The survival rate for children went up to 27% in the American Heart Association's Get With the Guidelines resuscitation in hospital registry of cardiac arrest and CPR. And unlike the out-of-hospital arrests, the vast majority have favorable neurological exams. The walkie-talkie, maybe not perfect, but doing pretty darn well is the outcome, because we don't have a prolonged period of no flow when nobody's doing bystander CPR. Well, Max Harry Weil was one of the founders of the the Society of Critical Care Medicine. He was a cardiologist. He was he started the shock trauma programs. He was Jean-Louis Vincent's mentor, and he said at this conference on CPR with CPR investigators, he was a mentor of mine as well, performing CPR without measuring the effects is like flying an airplane without an altimeter. And yet that's what we did for 30 years. And nobody was trying to do anything about that. Well, at this conference, there were people from Laerdal, Zoll, Phillips, and they said, we got engineers, we can come up with a way to measure at least what we're going to call CPR quality, but I would like to say is CPR mechanics instead of quality. It's not really telling you the quality of your CPR, it's telling you the quality of your resuscitation, which is a little different. It's what you're doing, not what the patient's receiving. But it still was pretty darn good. If we did what the American Heart Association said you're supposed to do, 51 millimeters of compression depth, or for these kids that were mostly adolescents, they had a higher rate of return of spontaneous circulation. They were more likely to survive to hospital discharge and have good neurologic outcome. So it was really great. And these rescuer-focused kinds of things are really made a difference. Well, I arrived at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia right around the time this was going on. And we were really great at putting on devices and looking at the monitors like we do in emergency medicine and say, did I push down hard enough? And did it give me feedback about, did I do it right? Everyone was looking down and seeing how far they should push on the chest, because there was a device that told them. And I came there with background of working in laboratory settings and knowing very well, like some of the people here from Innsbruck, that if you get the pressures up, outcomes are better. So I would look up. And sometimes I would say, hey, you got to push harder. The blood pressure is really low. It's 50/20. That's not going to bring anybody back. And they said, well, the monitor's on the right thing. I said, just look up. And one of my mentees, Bobby Sutton, has some slides where he has eyes pointing up and says, you just look up and you get better outcome. And I realized that very few people looked at physiology that didn't work in an animal lab. It's pretty sad. That's my family, they say hi. And we decided that we should think about patient-centric hemodynamic goals instead of rescuer-centric goals. Nothing wrong with the rescuer-centric goals. That was a big leap in terms of giving better care. but we could do better in my mind and in the mind of a few of the people that I talk with about setting up a group of experiments that we did over the next 10 years. It's about 15 years ago. So as you know, the CPR algorithms are rescue-centric. They tell you how many times a minute to push, how deep to push, don't lean, and give epinephrine every 3 to 5 minutes, whether it works or not. And tell me in medicine what you would be doing for 20 minutes. There's a lot of anesthesiologists here. Could you imagine a blood pressure drop? You're blinded to the blood pressure and just keep giving fluid. Same amount every few minutes. It's crazy. Yet it works. It's better than what not doing it is. But I think we can do better. It's not patient-centric. It's not physiology-directed. And we can do better. We can do what Max Herring-Weil wanted us to be able to do in the 1980s, and it's a lot of years, in the 1990s, and it's a lot of years later, and we should be able to be better. As I mentioned, we already knew that coronary perfusion pressure had better outcomes, but it doesn't fit into an evidence-based grade evaluation system that we have these animal models. We have to learn about something with people. But first step, we had to go and see, does it make sense as an interventional thing? So I'm still back at, I want to show rescue-centric versus provider-centric, and I haven't even shown that in an animal model. I just shown associations. They showed an association. Is it because they tried to get high pressures, or did it just happen by chance and they're unrelated? Well, we know that interventional trials give us the answer to that. But first we had to see if in asphyxial models it was the same thing. And we looked at the survivors from many asphyxial model experiments, and they had, on average, much higher than 20 coronary perfusion pressures, just like the VF models, and the ones that didn't were non-survivors. And then we came up with a system of hemodynamic-directed CPR. It was based on animal studies in Arizona and in Innsbruck, as a matter of fact. Much of the data is from Innsbruck. And we showed that to get a target coronary perfusion pressure of 20, if we push down in the chest hard enough to get systolic pressures around 100, which is what they did in Innsbruck and what we did in Arizona, and have better outcomes in other places, that got us part of the way there. And if the coronary perfusion pressure was greater than 20 when we got those high systolic pressures, don't give them any medicine. They don't need epinephrine. All I can do is cause harm. But if the pressure's down, we gave epinephrine. And instead of every 3 to 5 minutes, we looked at the data pharmacologically from our experiments. Within a minute, they had their maximum effect from epinephrine and blood pressure. So if we didn't have a higher blood pressure of coronary perfusion pressure of 20, we gave a second dose. And if a minute later it didn't work, that wasn't going to get us there. We used vasopressin. Some of these animals in the studies I'm going to show you received no vasopressor for 10 minutes of CPR. Some of them received a lot. And we gave the amount that was required to meet these, to get the pressures. So we had, in the first of these many experiments, we looked at blood pressure directive versus rescue-centric guideline-like care in an adult-like model with asphyxia, 7 minutes of a clamped endotracheal tube and 10 minutes of CPR. And I mentioned the blood pressure guided group. In the AHA guided group was the depth that was recommended, the chest compression rate, and epi every 4 minutes, whether needed or not. And it's not surprising in the middle of this picture that if you aim for a blood pressure, you get a blood pressure. And if you don't aim for a blood pressure, you're not as good at it. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. What stunned us is that the discrepancy in the survival rate with this very severe cardiac arrest model. 5 of 8 survived in the BP guided group, and 0 of 8 in the guideline-like rescue-centric group. Well, we didn't believe that alone. We looked at multiple models. These are most of them we've done in the last 10 years. VF models, asphyxia models, large 30-kilogram pigs that have a chest wall that's somewhat similar to adults, 10-kilogram ones that are more like young children. And we looked at shorter models, longer models. We looked at an LPS model because a lot of in-hospital cardiac arrests are due to sepsis. Every one of them had better outcomes better physiology, and better outcomes than our usual standard way. Now, some people were a little concerned that some of our animals got a lot of epinephrine, and as you know, that there's been some discussion that epinephrine might be a bad thing to the brain. Rostagno showed these really beautiful pictures like the ones you saw this morning that showed in the epinephrine group you don't see microvasculature much, and in the placebo group you do. And that raised the possibility that maybe what we were doing was not a good idea for the brain. And they looked at Lycox brain oxygen, and in their study, when they gave epinephrine instead of placebo in a very brief CPR model, there was worse perfusion of the brain. And there's been a lot discussed about that. Well, we looked at some of our animals. We did this in several studies, but here's one of them. That in the black line is the coronary perfusion pressure directed or the BP directed CPR. And our cerebral perfusion pressure was much higher. This is not surprising. Cerebral perfusion pressure is mean arterial pressure minus central venous pressure. If I made my diastolic pressure up, my mean pressure is going to be up. I'm going to have better pressures. Now, does that equal flow? That's important. Well, we looked at tissue oxygenation, and it was dramatically better. And we weren't the only ones that looked at that. Nasrati et al., we have some people here from Toronto, that group there showed the same thing. Improvements in brain oxygenation with the epinephrine in their experiments, and the ones that didn't get epinephrine in their experiments had worse perfusion and worse oxygenation. Putzer here from Innsbruck, Gabby and Edith, who was here today, showed in their studies similarly better perfusion and better oxygenation of the brain with epinephrine than without. So I'm not saying that Rostagno's is not right. It's a more complex story, and on average, we seem to be doing better with epinephrine than without epinephrine, although I'm sure that what he showed happens in some vascular beds. Well, what about function of the brain? Well, Todd Kilbaugh, who now runs our lab, our CPR lab, looked at mitochondrial respiration, and you can see that in the depth-guided or guideline-guided CPR, there's a big drop compared to the shams in terms of mitochondrial respiration. In this hemodynamic-directed CPR that had more epinephrine on average, there was much better mitochondrial respiration. And looking at the brain, we looked at, again, at some level of function, which is mitochondrial respiration. There was dramatically better. And of course, with higher survival rates, there were also higher rates of survival with good neurologic function. And most of these animals were later that day, if not the next morning, walking around and drinking and looking like a relatively normal animal. In 2013, the American Heart Association had a position paper on CPR resuscitation quality, and they said high-quality CPR is the primary component influencing survival. Sort of made sense, and you should monitor it. But they didn't say what to do because nobody had data about what we should be doing with it. The guidelines said for patients with invasive hemodynamic monitoring in place at the time of cardiac arrest, it's reasonable to look at the blood pressure to guide your CPR, but because the precise numerical targets for these parameters during resuscitations for adults or children have not yet been established, these were specified. These were not specified. It is 64 years since that publication, and we can make that statement, shame on us. So why don't we titrate to arterial blood pressures? Well, for one thing, the basic life support guidelines are mostly focused on what you guys are mostly focused on, which is adults without a hospital cardiac arrest, where traditionally said it's not very practical. I didn't see that article that Simon showed in 2024 that it was practical in their system, but there's been a few systems where people have shown they can do it for brief periods of time, and most of them have stopped doing it. Yet nearly as many adults in hospital cardiac arrest as out of hospital in the United States. It's about even. There's about 360,000 out of hospital and 300,000 in hospital. That's about the same. And yet, in hospital, many of them are in intensive care units. Many of them have arterial blood pressure lines, and here we have nobody looking at it. We're looking at the genomes of everything that goes on with sepsis. We have all kinds of cool things about fluids and glycocalyces. Nobody's looked at a blood pressure. Unbelievable. I'm sorry for being sarcastic. I'm trying to stimulate some people to want to do something, because you are the people that are going to make the difference for out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, not me. Inadequate, and basically the one point that is true is we have inadequate data to have guidelines. And having been on the guidelines side, you need data. So we have a big problem for pediatric in-hospital cardiac arrest. Maybe it's not like 300,000 Americans a year having, adults having cardiac arrest, but 15,000 kids a year is a pretty big deal. And since if you survive and you survive normally, you have a full life, it's actually order of magnitude similar to adults in terms of quality of life years that are available. But there's about 15,000 a year, and there's about 7,000 out of hospital. Almost all of them are in intensive care units. And in our place, 50% of them have an art line, and in studies we've done at other places, it's between 40 and 60% have an art line. You could just look up. But first you have to gather some data. So we did the Pediatric Intensive Care Quality of CPR study with our National Collaborative Pediatric Critical Care Research Network of about 10 children's hospitals. And our hypothesis is that, just like the animals, blood pressure is going to be associated with survival, which seems simple at the time, but many people doubted it. And we said, like the animals, maybe 30 millimeters of mercury, diastolic was reasonable. We couldn't look at coronary perfusion pressure because we weren't getting continuous CVPs regularly. And we said, oh, small babies will say a little bit less. And we had to a priori determine what we were going to look at. You know, they force you to look ahead of time, and the journals want to know, what did you say ahead of time you're going to do? And they're appropriate. They don't let you fish. And the outcome was survival at the hospital discharge. And luckily enough, there was about a 70% more likely to survive if you met these targets than if you didn't, and survival favorable neuro outcome was very similar. And that was published in 2018. And this is what these cubic spline curves look like in the greater than 1 year of age, and the less than 1 year of age was about the same. And you can see there's this good old red, yellow, green. That's what we like to see, huh? And that green area above 30 was pretty flat. And just like the swine, if you got less than 30, it dropped off pretty rapidly. And if you got a lot less than 30, you got less than 20, almost nobody survived. We had one survivor under 20. There was an ICU resus interventional bundle. I'm not going to talk a lot about it, except there was an interventional study looking at point of care practice and interdisciplinary debriefing, focusing on physiology, pre-arrest, intra-arrest, and post-arrest. I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but we happened to put as an embedded study a priori a validation study of the diastolic blood pressure. You know how these work. We do the discovery, and then when we look back at it, it's never as good. And wasn't quite as good, but it was pretty darn good that if we aim for the thresholds that were used in animals, it turns out they worked in humans pretty well. It was physiology that made sense, and it was associated with survival. So I'm hoping that there'll be a little bit stronger statements about what we might be able to look for. But we still haven't really shown that in an interventional trial with humans that aiming for these blood pressures would make a difference. But here's something that's really, I think, more amazing than that study so far. The PICU CPR database came from this collaborative pediatric critical care research network of 10 large children's hospitals. Like we have a 75-bed intensive care unit. These are, and that was from 2013 to March of 2016. All of the sites knew about the findings. We published it, and we started the next study, the ICU resus study, in October, 6 months later. Look at those diastolic blood pressures on average. How many met those criteria? Once critical care doctors know something works, they spread it pretty fast. The old system of it takes 17 years, it's still probably true, it takes 17 years on average for new findings in medicine and new guidelines to make a difference in clinical practice. It took 6 months. Pediatric intensive care doctors don't like their patients dying. And my guess is that's true for emergency medicine doctors too. And if you look at the mean diastolic pressures and the mean systolic pressures, they were 10 higher throughout here. Well, what did that mean for outcomes? When we had such good return of spontaneous circulation, up to 2/3, and we put ECMO on another 1/5 of them. But look what happens when you start giving good perfusion of your heart and your brain. Survival to discharge went up to 59% in just a few-year period from 47%. And most of those survivors were with favorable neuro outcome. And it wasn't just in the United States. The only European study I could see was in 2021. Mustafa et al. Showed in the PICUs in pediatric intensive care units in the UK, they've been doing the same sorts of things. They've been incorporating what was new in the data. They didn't wait 17 years, and they were having excellent hemodynamics and excellent outcomes. So where are we today? If you aim for those kinds of reasonable targets, we know that it's associated with survival to hospital discharge. We think that targeting them may improve outcomes. My discussion up until now suggests that I know it, but I actually don't. That would require a trial of BP-targeted CPR, but it makes all the sense in the world. Future directions include other physiologic targets, like end-tidal CO2, cerebral NIRS, and pulse oximetry. But before I start thinking that we did such great work in the last 20 years, sometimes you'll read some literature and you get a little bit humbled. It was in the 19th century in Germany that two young boys that had anesthesia and probably got too much ether, had cardiac arrest. They started doing CPR. The first part of the discussion is they were doing compressions to the chest to get him to breathe, and they were going at a rate of 20 to 40, and nothing good happened. And then, quote, one presses deep in the heart region with strong movements at a frequency of 120 or more. The effectiveness of the efforts is recognized from physiologic measurements, the artificially produced carotid pulse, and the constriction of the pupils. Some people might argue that that was the first description of physiology-directed CPR. I don't know if that's true. Are there other ways that we can individualize or personalize CPR? Of course there are. So one of them is by one of my mentees, Ryan Morgan, who noticed in our animal models, which have been noticed for many years in Innsbruck and Hopkins at the University of Arizona, that some animals responded to epinephrine and some had no response whatsoever. It's all over the literature, but everybody ignores it. He took a look at the ICU resusc data, and what was special about that data is we went through a large hunk of stuff to make sure we actually looked at the waveforms for every single one, and we annotated it and curated it at our place with just a couple people. I didn't go into the details of that. And without that, all you have is garbage in and garbage out. So you need to have annotated real physiologic data. And what he saw is the black lines are on average what our response is to epinephrine. And the one on top, the green, responders and non-responders for each group. And it turned out about half of the patients had a less than 5 millimeter of mercury response to epinephrine. About half. Did it make a difference? Oh my gosh. The DBP responders were much more likely to have return of spontaneous circulations than those that did not. So that raises a whole bunch of issues. Should we be thinking about them differently? Is this a patient that should be getting different dosing like our animal hemodynamic directed CPR, more frequent monitoring? And there's a whole bunch of evidence we have of less than 2 minutes is better than more than 2 minutes. I'm not going to get into that. Should we use a different drug? Should we use vasopressin? Interesting, in Austria, Volker Wenzel in Innsbruck was probably the biggest proponent of using vasopressin. He and his mentor, Karl Lindner, and they looked really promising, and it just fell off with one randomized trial. But maybe it's the right approach. Should we do something different? If at the end of 5 minutes we don't have a patient come back with epi and we don't see a response, should we start calling the ECMO team? We can keep these people alive. Well, another approach is end-tidal CO2-directed CPR, and there's very little information about that. This is from the Hopkins group that looked at the top lines in both of these are when they looked at the end-tidal CO2 and tried to optimize it. The bottom lines is when they gave standard CPR and they didn't look at the blood pressure and they didn't look at the end-tidal CO2. The top one, they didn't look at the blood pressure. They just looked at end-tidal CO2, and they ended up with better blood pressures in one curve, better cerebral perfusion pressures in the other curve, and better outcomes. So maybe we can direct it to something that's more easily available, like end-tidal CO2, but I have to tell you, I'm a little bit more skeptical because of the numbers for a whole bunch of reasons. Nevertheless, when we looked at our ICU resus data, we did see that if the end-tidal CO2 was greater than 20 on average for that 10 minutes of CPR, survival rates were higher in response to circulation. And I know there's a lot of interest in this area by Simon and others about the opening index and how do we measure hemodynamics. There's a lot of complicated things that I've known from animal studies for a long time that make it very difficult to depend on end-tidal CO2. On the other hand, it's at least something that's easily available and we should think about it. How about NIRS? This is hot off the press in the last 2 months. A study in children from another one of our networks that's run out of our hospital, CHOP, that has, I believe, 60 or 70, including sites in Europe, where we looked at the sites that looked at median cerebral regional oxygen saturation during pediatric and hospital cardiac arrest. And those that survived had a median regional oxygen saturation, median NIRS of 44%, and those that didn't had lower ones. Similarly with survival with favorable neurologic outcomes. So perhaps NIRS is helpful, but I'm a little bit more skeptical about use of something that is so slowly responsive, that averages time over many minutes, and use that as something to aim for. Nevertheless, I'd be remiss to not say that's something you just can put on the forehead and take a look. And there are some studies in adults, again, showing that NIRS goes up when we do better CPR, and maybe it's something we can follow. It's less than perfect, but it's nothing's perfect. And here's a really exciting one from, and we have data that's very similar to this. We're not as fast at publishing as the Chinese group, a pulse oximeter. So many of you probably noticed you have a pulse oximeter on a patient, then they have an arrest, and you have a flat line, and then you see it come back, and you think, I wonder if that's good. And what they showed is when the arterial waveform went away, there was no pulse. When the patients had a VF, there was no pulse, there was no pulse ox. They did poor CPR and good CPR. When they did poor CPR, the blood pressures were bad, and there was low amplitude on their pulse ox. When it was better, it was better. We have some engineers looking with us at some cute little AI and machine learning kind of stuff, and looking at various aspects of the VF of the pulse ox waveform, and some of the things on the pulse ox waveform may turn out to be highly related to diastolic pressure in a non-invasive way to look at what's going on. We're hopeful, but we're not there yet. We've been hopeful for 3-4 years. Hopefully we'll have this published very soon. We have the data. And the pulse oximeter, high-quality pulse oximeter, with high-quality CPR, your PETs, your end-tidal CO2, and your CPP, your cerebral perfusion pressure, were much better. So having a good waveform, having better amplitude, and having better physiology sort of fit very nicely in this swine study. And I know there's plenty of people around the world trying to replicate this in one way or another with humans. And when that happens, we're going to have something change. And it's like so many of these things, it looks like nothing until the day it's successful. And then it becomes standard practice. I'm hoping. Well, these are my grandsons, Jack and Benny. And I'm going to finish with something that Simon asked me to do, which was, what about the adults? So that was nice for them, but what about the adults? Opportunities. There's a large number of people having cardiac arrests, very few of them having art lines in place. It's really cool to see what they were talking about in Denmark. That's really wonderful. I'm told you guys have a lot of you are anesthesiologists and put art lines in the field. Gathering that information in a systematic manner could be the difference, and it has to be done in a coordinated fashion. There are a lot of people in the United States, and there's similar numbers for each in the European Union, but it's a little bit hard to get the numbers exactly. That happen, and most of them are in similar numbers of in-hospital and out-of-hospital. Most of them are in ICUs. In the United States, 30% of the adults that have a cardiac arrest have an art line in place, yet there's almost nothing written about diastolic blood pressures, except that Simon has on his slide that we can aim for 30 to 40. Boy, I'd like to see some data that shows that that's a good idea. I think it's probably right. You can derive, the greater you in the adult world, can derive and validate threshold targets for diastolic blood pressure and tidal CO2, maybe for NIRS, maybe for SpO2. I think that's coming in the next 10 years. We've been talking about it for 15 years. Lots of people have. It's time for us to do that. And then obviously interventional trials. And of course there has been data. Norm Paradis in 1990, working with Mandy Rivers, who was originally a cardiac arrest investigator, and as part of their studies for post-cardiac arrest, during CPR, they were putting in arterial lines and central lines back in the late 1980s in Detroit. And they showed that if I got good enough coronary perfusion pressures, just like these animal studies, I have a chance to have ROSC, but I have no ROSC if I have low ones. The problem was that by the time they got from the scene where there was about a 15% incidence of bystander CPR in Detroit at the time, to the time that they got to the lines place, none of the patients survived. And for that reason, there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm. The arterial access was just too late. But Simon just said, hey, it's feasible to do in the field. My good friend Ben Abella, who's a leader in emergency medicine, and a few other groups together showed that the mean end-tidal CO2 and outcomes were related. But those were, the group that did not survive had greater than 20, which I said was a target for kids. There's a lot of problems with the data. They did not have all the waveform data. They didn't have it in precise information yet, and it doesn't have a multivariable analysis with it. It was just some raw numbers. Nevertheless, it's sort of encouraging that maybe something with end-tidal CO2 can be done besides the literature up to now, which says if you never get above 10 for a long period of time, game over. I'd like to have something positive. And the Greek group has done incredible stuff. Xanthos and Chalkios have done these amazing things with vasopressin, epi, and steroids that a lot of people put down on. I think there's fantastic studies that they're doing, and they're doing it in an RCT way. It was really fantastic. They've had a publication of what their plan was, the Perseus resuscitation protocol, which is personalized physiology-guided resuscitation of highly monitored patients in the ICU. And these clever anesthesiologists talk about if this, then this, if this, when do we give Valium, when do we give this drug, when do we give that? You can't see all the parts because it's complicated and nobody knows what's going to work yet. But there is a way to start thinking about how we're going to approach in a physiologic manner what we can do for patients. So in conclusion, physiology-directed CPR improves outcomes clearly in animal models. That attaining blood pressures and end-tidal CO2s above a target are associated with better outcomes than not doing it, but maybe those aren't the optimal targets yet. We have not unlocked physiology-directed pediatric CPR yet, but we're interested and we're focused. Non-invasive physiologic parameters such as end-tidal, NIRS, and various aspects of the pulse ox waveform are attractive and potentially ways to change the future. But interventional trials will be necessary to establish that these are the right things to do. I don't know the pediatric intensivists have equipoise. They tell me they don't. But in adult medicine, you guys do a much better job than we do of that, and I want to congratulate you once you get those targets to go for. And these are just a handful of the people involved in all of these studies I just mentioned. I can't do justice to mention all of them. CPR is a team sport, as is emergency medicine. And I want to thank you for taking your afternoon for a few minutes and listening to me. Thank you so much.